The runway lights went out at 0:55. Not dimmed. Not flickering. Gone. Major Carroll Smith was 3 miles from the ground, descending through absolute black, his fuel gauge sinking below 10%. No moon. No horizon. No visual reference of any kind. Just instruments glowing faint green in the cockpit, and the low, steady hum of 2 radial engines burning the last minutes of gasoline they would ever get. 50 minutes earlier, he had been hunting. Now, there was nothing left to fight. The ocean was somewhere beneath him. The jungle was somewhere ahead. And the runway he was supposed to land on existed only as a set of coordinates in his head. If his math was wrong by even a few degrees, the aircraft would touch nothing but darkness before tearing itself apart. This was not how night fighter missions ended. They were supposed to end with bombers falling, fires burning on the water, and pilots turning home with fuel to spare. Smith had done everything right. He had intercepted the enemy in total darkness. He had destroyed every aircraft that mattered. The airfield below him was intact. Thousands of American engineers were still alive because of what he had done in the sky. And yet, none of that mattered anymore. Because victory did not guarantee survival. The fuel needle trembled just above empty. At cruise power, he had minutes. Not enough to divert. Not enough to climb. Not enough to circle and wait for the lights to come back on. Whatever decision he made next would be final. Behind him, his radar operator spoke quietly, reading numbers off a scope that could see terrain but not safety. Altitude above ground. Rate of descent. Distance to where the runway should be. There was no second attempt. If Smith descended too fast, the aircraft would hit the ground before he could react. Too slow, and the engines would cough dry over the jungle or the sea. The aircraft was heavy with ammunition, empty of margin. Every control input burned fuel. Every second in the air was a subtraction he could not afford. He lowered the nose. The altimeter unwound. 500 feet. 400. 3. The ground remained invisible. Somewhere below, crushed coral waited. Or trees. Or water. The enemy had failed to kill him. The mission had succeeded. The night raids were over. But the war had not released him. Not yet. Because if logic said this mission was finished, one question remained unanswered. Why was this night still trying to kill him? By December 1944, the Japanese believed night belonged to them. It was not arrogance. It was doctrine. For 3 years of war in the Pacific, darkness had been protection. American fighters could not see. Searchlights were unreliable. Anti-aircraft fire at night was inaccurate, reactive, and often too late. Japanese bomber crews learned that if they flew after sunset, at medium altitude, straight and steady, most missions would get through. Losses were acceptable. Success rates were high. So they built a system around it. Night raids were scheduled, repeated, methodical. Bombers launched after dusk, approached along predictable corridors, released their loads, and vanished back into black sky before defenders could react. It worked well enough that by late 1944, Japanese planners no longer treated night bombing as risky. It was routine. Moro was proof. For 2 weeks straight, the airfield area had been under constant attack. 334 air raid alerts in 14 nights. Sometimes one bomber. Sometimes many. Sometimes high altitude. Sometimes low. The goal was not precision. It was exhaustion. Keep the engineers awake. Kill a few men each night. Delay construction long enough to break the invasion timetable. If the airfields at Moro were finished, American fighters could cover the Lingayen Gulf landings. That meant air superiority from the first day ashore. The Japanese could not allow that. So they sent bombers every night. And by the math of air defense, the Japanese should have been right. A night fighter patrol did not work like daylight combat. There were no formations sweeping the sky. No visual spotting. No quick engagements. Everything took time. Finding one aircraft in darkness required coordination, patience, and luck. Finding many was nearly impossible. One interceptor could not stop 12 bombers. Fuel alone made that clear. A night fighter carried enough fuel for roughly 3 hours of flight. Each intercept, from detection to destruction, could take 10 minutes or more. That included climbing, positioning, firing, confirming the kill, and reorienting for the next target. Even under perfect conditions, a single aircraft might engage 3 bombers before fuel forced it home. The rest would get through. This was not speculation. It was experience. Most night fighter missions ended without contact at all. The sky was vast. Radar coverage was limited. Targets slipped through gaps constantly. Even when contact was made, bombers often escaped into cloud or darkness before weapons could be brought to bear. The Japanese understood this math. They depended on it. They also understood American caution. Night fighting was dangerous. Midair collisions. Spatial disorientation. Friendly fire. Commanders did not encourage reckless pursuit after fuel dropped below safety margins. Returning alive mattered. Preserving trained crews mattered. Doctrine said disengage. That doctrine existed for a reason. Over open ocean, at night, a forced landing was a death sentence. Without visual references, altitude was guesswork. Pilots flew into the water without realizing they were descending. Even if they survived impact, rescue was unlikely. Darkness hid wreckage. Fuel fires consumed evidence. Men vanished. Everyone involved in night operations knew this. Which is why the Japanese plan assumed something critical, that no American pilot would keep pressing after the safe point. That someone would eventually choose survival over interception. On the night of December 29, 12 bombers were launched with that assumption built in. 12 aircraft, separated by miles, different altitudes, different headings, all converging on the same target area. Even if one was intercepted, the others would continue. Even if 2 were lost, the mission would succeed. There was no scenario in which a single night fighter could stop them all. Not without violating the math. Not without ignoring fuel limits. Not without accepting that the return flight might not exist. This was the wall. The hard limit. The reason Japanese planners could send crews into darkness with confidence. The reason Moro was still under attack night after night. And it was the reason no one on either side expected what happened next. Because somewhere above the Philippine Islands, one aircraft was airborne with a full ammunition load, a finite fuel supply, and a radar screen glowing softly in the dark. And its pilot was already running the numbers. Not to see if he could survive. But to see how many bombers he could reach before survival stopped being an option. Carroll Smith did not look like someone destined to rewrite doctrine. At 26, he was already a major, but rank came faster in wartime than wisdom. He had flown 43 combat missions before that night. 4 confirmed kills. Enough experience to know how fragile confidence could be, and how quickly it disappeared when instruments were all you had left. Night flying stripped pilots of their instincts. There was no horizon to trust. No peripheral vision to warn of movement. The inner ear lied constantly, telling the body it was climbing when it was diving, turning when it was straight. Pilots learned early that trusting sensation at night was how men died. You trusted numbers. Gauges. Voices on the intercom. And even those could betray you. Smith had trained for this role for over a year. Night fighter school drilled procedures into muscle memory until they became automatic. Radar intercept geometry. Closing speeds. Lead angles in darkness. Emergency procedures for engine failure with no visual reference. Fuel management under combat power. Everything was rehearsed, calculated, reduced to steps. But training assumed one thing would always exist. Margin. Margin of fuel. Margin of time. Margin to abort. That night, margin was already disappearing. Smith knew his aircraft well. The P-61 was powerful, stable, forgiving compared to earlier night fighters. It could absorb mistakes that would have killed pilots in lighter aircraft. But it was also heavy. It burned fuel aggressively at high power. Every climb, every correction, every chase shortened the return window. Behind him sat Philip Porter, his radar operator. Porter was not a passenger. He was half the aircraft. In daylight fighters, the pilot saw and decided. At night, vision belonged to the radar operator. Porter interpreted a glowing scope that most pilots barely understood. He tracked blips that could be enemy aircraft, friendly fighters, or nothing at all. Ground returns blurred into clutter. Weather distorted shapes. False echoes appeared and vanished. Good radar operators were rare. Exceptional ones were irreplaceable. Porter had been doing this for 6 months. Long enough to know that radar was not magic. It did not show intent. It did not show mistakes until they were too late. It showed position and speed, nothing more. Everything else had to be inferred. That required judgment. Judgment was where doubt lived. Smith trusted Porter. He had to. But trust did not erase the questions that crept in with every intercept. Was that return really a bomber, or a ghost? Was the closure rate accurate, or was the target turning? Were they being vectored efficiently, or wasting fuel chasing echoes that led nowhere? There was no ground controller guiding them. No safety net. Once airborne, the decisions belonged entirely to the 2 men inside the aircraft. Smith also knew something uncomfortable about himself. He was not reckless. He was not the type to chase kills for glory. He had watched pilots die doing exactly that. He understood restraint. He believed in returning home alive. Which made the situation worse. Because the rational choice was clear. After the first intercept, maybe the second, doctrine would have supported disengagement. Fuel would already be trending toward the caution zone. There would be justification in reporting partial success. Bombers might still get through, but that was expected. No one would blame a pilot for obeying limits written in blood. But rational choices did not protect the men sleeping below. Every bomber that reached Morro meant more casualties. Engineers, construction crews, guards. Men who did not have radar screens or altitude indicators. Men who trusted that someone else was watching the sky. Smith was aware of that trust. He had felt it before, in daylight missions where ground troops advanced under air cover. But at night, it was heavier. Invisible. Absolute. There was no spectacle of battle to distract from responsibility. Just the quiet knowledge that failure would not be abstract. It would be counted in bodies. Porter broke the silence periodically with updates. Bearings. Ranges. Altitudes. Each call was calm, professional. But Smith could hear the effort behind it. Radar work at night was mentally exhausting. Staring at a glowing screen in darkness, filtering noise from signal, making continuous judgments without pause. Fatigue dulled perception. Mistakes multiplied. Smith wondered how long Porter could maintain that level of precision. He wondered how long he himself could. As the night progressed, the questions stacked on top of each other. How many intercepts could they realistically complete? How much fuel was too little? At what point did persistence become stupidity? None of those questions had clean answers. There was only one thing Smith knew with certainty. If he turned back too early, he would live with it. And that might be harder to survive than the night itself. The Japanese did not misunderstand American pilots. They misunderstood the machine. For most of the war, night combat followed a simple rule: if you could not see the enemy, you could not fight him. Darkness erased speed advantages, marksmanship, formation tactics. Pilots flew by feel and instinct, and both failed after sunset. That reality shaped every assumption Japanese planners made. The P-61 Black Widow existed to violate those assumptions. It was not fast by daylight standards. It was not agile in the way a dogfighter needed to be. What it had instead was stability, endurance, and a nose built around something no Japanese bomber crew had ever faced in combat. Radar. The SCR-720 was not magic, but it was decisive. A rotating dish in the nose sent out pulses that did not care about clouds or moonlight. When those pulses struck metal, they came back. On a glowing scope behind the pilot, darkness turned into geometry. Range. Bearing. Closure. For the first time in the Pacific, night was no longer empty. But radar alone did not kill aircraft. What mattered was how it was used. Night interception was a problem of angles, not speed. A pilot could not simply chase a target. Closing too fast meant overshooting into darkness. Closing too slow meant wasting fuel while the bomber crept closer to its target. The correct approach required patience, constant adjustment, and precise communication between pilot and radar operator. Smith did not fly toward blips. He flew toward predicted movement. Porter watched how targets shifted on the scope. Slight changes in bearing revealed turns before they were visible. Rate of closure exposed speed differences. Experienced radar operators learned to anticipate, not react. They vectored pilots into positions where the enemy would be, not where it was. That anticipation saved fuel. It also reduced exposure. Japanese bombers relied on the belief that no one could approach unseen. They carried defensive guns, but those guns assumed visual warning. Gunners scanned darkness for silhouettes or muzzle flashes. There was no tail warning radar. No electronic alert. No reason to expect an attacker to be sitting calmly in blind space. Smith exploited that blind space. Instead of attacking from directly behind, where gunners expected threats, he approached from slightly below and offset. Most Japanese bombers had weak ventral coverage. The belly was a structural necessity, not a defensive priority. Fuel tanks ran through the wings. Engines were exposed. One short burst from 20mm cannons was enough. That was why engagements were brief. 2 seconds. Sometimes 3. Longer bursts were wasteful. Ammunition mattered less than fuel, but both were finite. Smith fired only when geometry guaranteed results. When the guns spoke, the outcome was decided before the bomber crew understood what was happening. This efficiency made something else possible. Time compression. Each successful intercept shortened the window for the next. Instead of chasing bombers individually from patrol patterns, Smith and Porter began thinking in sequences. Which target could be reached with minimal climb? Which altitude change conserved fuel? Which intercept geometry reduced repositioning time? The machine enabled this thinking. The P-61 was stable enough to hold precise attitudes in darkness. Its twin engines allowed confident climbs and controlled descents. It absorbed turbulence without violent oscillation. That stability reduced pilot workload and freed mental capacity for calculation. But the same machine carried its own trap. Fuel consumption. At combat power, the engines drank fuel at a rate that punished indecision. Every unnecessary climb, every extended chase, every correction burned minutes off the return. Unlike bombers, which could limp home on fumes, the Black Widow demanded discipline. The blind spot was not in the sky. It was in the math. Japanese planners assumed night fighters would disengage once fuel reached caution levels. They assumed pilots valued survival over persistence. They assumed no one would deliberately fly into the zone where return was uncertain. Smith understood that assumption. He also understood its flaw. Radar changed the risk equation. Darkness no longer protected the bomber. It only delayed detection. Once detected, the bomber's survival depended entirely on whether the interceptor chose to continue. The Japanese system relied on the belief that continuation would stop. Smith did not stop. Each intercept tightened the margins. Fuel dropped below levels taught in training. The buffer vanished. But the machine still responded. Radar still painted targets. Guns still worked. As long as those systems functioned, the mission felt possible. That feeling was dangerous. Because it masked the true failure point. Not radar. Not weapons. Not skill. The real vulnerability lay beneath him. An unfinished airfield. Minimal lighting. No instrument landing system. A strip of crushed coral carved out of jungle, marked by kerosene lamps that could vanish with a single failure. The P-61 could hunt in darkness. It could not land in it without help. That was the blind spot no one could eliminate. The final dependency. The one place where technology could not compensate for absence. Smith knew this. He knew that every successful intercept pushed him closer to a point where winning the fight meant risking death on return. He knew that the machine that gave him power in the sky demanded precision on the ground. And yet, as the radar scope continued to glow and targets continued to appear, the logic of stopping became harder to justify. Because as long as the Black Widow could see, the night was no longer safe for anyone else. The fuel gauge crossed below 30% without ceremony. No alarm. No warning tone. Just a needle drifting past a number every pilot was trained to respect. 30% was not empty, but it was no longer comfortable. It marked the boundary between planned flight and contingency. Between returning home and hoping nothing went wrong. Doctrine was clear about what came next. Disengage. Night fighter manuals did not encourage heroics. They were written by men who understood how little margin existed after dark. Below certain fuel thresholds, the aircraft was no longer a weapon. It was a liability. Every additional minute airborne multiplied risk without proportional gain. Smith knew the rule. He had taught versions of it to younger pilots. He had watched others ignore it and disappear. Fuel exhaustion at night did not forgive skill or experience. It punished everyone equally. And yet, as Porter called out another contact, the rule stopped feeling absolute. The radar scope did not show a boundary. It showed opportunity. Another target. Another vector. Another chance to prevent bombs from reaching the airfield. Each new return on the scope reframed the situation. Stopping now would not undo the damage already prevented, but it would allow the remaining bombers to complete their mission unchallenged. Smith considered the alternatives. He could turn back immediately, land safely, and report partial success. The mission would be logged as effective but incomplete. Bombs would fall. Engineers might die. Construction would be delayed. Commanders would understand. No one would accuse him of failure. He could also continue. Continuing meant betting that efficiency could overcome arithmetic. That the time saved by clean intercepts would offset the fuel burn chasing them. That nothing unexpected would happen on return. That the airfield lights would be on. That engines would not hiccup. That weather would remain cooperative. None of those were guarantees. Porter's voice cut through the cockpit again. Another contact. Different altitude. Closing fast. Smith did not answer immediately. This was not a moment of bravado. It was a calculation stripped of emotion. He weighed probabilities, not pride. How many minutes did the intercept require? How much fuel would the climb cost? Could the engagement be completed in one pass? Most importantly, what happened if he stopped? Stopping meant accepting that men on the ground would pay the difference. That was the variable Doctrine did not account for. Manuals treated fuel as the limiting factor. Smith treated consequences as the constraint. The equation shifted. Survival remained important, but it was no longer the sole objective. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines responded, heavy and deliberate. The aircraft began to climb. Fuel flowed faster. The margin shrank again. This was the moment the mission crossed a line. Everything before it could be defended as adherence to procedure. Everything after it existed outside written guidance. Smith was no longer executing a plan. He was improvising within shrinking boundaries. He did not know how many intercepts remained possible. He did not know what condition the runway would be in when he returned. He did not know if the lights would still be burning, or if someone on the ground would make a mistake that erased his last option. What he did know was this. If he turned back now, the night would belong to the bombers again. Breaking the rule did not feel dramatic. It felt quiet. Clinical. Almost inevitable. The aircraft climbed toward the next altitude. The radar scope steadied. The guns were ready. There would be no celebration if this worked. There would only be fewer explosions below. And if it failed, the reason would be simple. He had chosen to keep fighting after the rule said stop. The fourth intercept came easier than it should have. That was the first warning. By the time Smith rolled the Black Widow onto its new heading, the cockpit no longer felt rushed. The engine settled into a steady rhythm. Porter's voice, calm and precise, fed him bearings and altitudes like numbers in a solved equation. The radar scope glowed with clarity. No clutter. No confusion. Everything was working. The bomber appeared exactly where Porter predicted. Medium altitude. Straight and level. No evasive movement. No defensive awareness. It flew as if the night were still empty, as if nothing had changed. Smith closed from below and offset, the aircraft sliding into position with mechanical certainty. At 400 yards, the silhouette sharpened against cloud shadow. At 300, exhaust flames flickered faintly. The bomber never altered course. 2 seconds of fire were enough. The shells struck, and the aircraft disintegrated into flame and falling debris. There was no prolonged fight. No return fire. No maneuvering. The engagement ended almost as soon as it began. That efficiency should have been reassuring. Instead, it was dangerous. Because success hid the cost. Smith glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle had moved again. Not dramatically. Just enough to remind him that the arithmetic was still running, even when everything felt under control. He did not announce the number. Porter did not ask. Both men knew where they were trending. Another contact appeared. Then another. Separated by distance, but aligned in timing. Different altitudes, converging on the same point on the ground. The Japanese plan was revealing itself through radar returns. Not a swarm, but a pattern. Enough spacing to overwhelm interception, but not enough to avoid detection entirely. Smith and Porter adapted. They stopped thinking in terms of single engagements and started thinking in flows. Climb only when necessary. Descend whenever possible. Choose targets that required minimal repositioning. Let geometry do the work that power would otherwise consume. This was where training paid off. Years of procedural discipline allowed improvisation without chaos. Smith trusted the aircraft's stability. Porter trusted his ability to predict motion. They trimmed excess from every movement. No wasted turns. No extended chases. No second passes. Each kill compressed time. Minutes that should not have existed appeared between intercepts. Enough to reposition. Enough to catch the next target before it reached release point. The ground below remained dark and quiet. No flashes. No explosions. The absence of catastrophe became confirmation that the plan was working. That was the illusion of control. Because control depended on conditions that could vanish without warning. Fuel continued to drain. Every engagement, no matter how clean, shortened the return window. Smith stopped checking the gauge as often. Not because he forgot, but because looking too frequently would invite hesitation. He tracked consumption mentally, converting minutes into distance, distance into probability. The aircraft responded flawlessly. Engines held steady temperatures. No vibration. No warning lights. The radar scope remained clear. Guns functioned without jams. For a brief stretch of time, the system behaved as if it had been designed specifically for this sequence of events. Smith allowed himself no relief. He knew how fragile this phase was. Control in combat was not a permanent state. It was borrowed. Temporary. Revocable. The Japanese were not adapting yet. Bomber crews continued flying straight and level. No radical course changes. No defensive weaving. No evidence they understood what was happening around them. From their perspective, aircraft were simply failing to return. Darkness swallowed them without explanation. That ignorance bought Smith time. But it could not last. Porter called out another contact, closer to the airfield than the rest. Lower altitude. Faster closure. This one would require commitment. A climb would cost fuel. A delayed intercept would allow bombs to fall. Smith made the adjustment without hesitation. The Black Widow pitched upward, engines digging deeper into their reserves. The aircraft remained stable, but the margin thinned. Smith felt it not as fear, but as awareness. A tightening. A sense that the phase where choices were flexible was ending. He checked the fuel gauge again. It was approaching a number he had promised himself not to cross. Control still existed. But it was becoming conditional. And somewhere ahead, beyond radar range and prediction, waited the moment when efficiency would no longer be enough. The moment control vanished, it did not announce itself. It slipped. Smith realized it not through panic, but through silence. Porter had stopped filling the cockpit with constant updates. The radar scope showed fewer returns now. Not because the sky was empty, but because the remaining targets were either too low, too scattered, or too close to the airfield to allow clean geometry. The Japanese were no longer flying the problem Smith had prepared for. They were reacting. One bomber broke pattern and descended sharply, hugging lower altitude where radar returns blurred into ground clutter. Another altered course unpredictably, forcing Porter to re-evaluate closure rates every few seconds. These were not coordinated tactics. They were instinctive attempts to survive. But instinct was enough to disrupt efficiency. Efficiency had been the only thing keeping Smith alive. Fuel slipped below the line he had promised himself not to cross. He noticed immediately. He always had. The number meant nothing on its own. What mattered was what it represented, the loss of contingency. There was no longer time to recover from error. No buffer for miscalculation. Every maneuver now borrowed against landing. Porter called out a final viable target. Low altitude. Fast approach toward the airfield. This one would reach bomb release point in minutes. Smith hesitated. This was the point doctrine had been written for. Below this fuel state, the aircraft was not a weapon. It was transportation, and transportation had to end soon or not at all. But the bomber was close enough now that turning back felt indistinguishable from abandonment. Smith committed. The Black Widow descended aggressively, trading altitude for speed, conserving fuel in theory while spending it in practice. The aircraft responded, but the handling felt heavier. Not degraded, but less forgiving. Smith was aware of every correction now. Nothing felt free. The bomber came into view late. Lower than expected. Dark against darker terrain. Smith adjusted position, but the approach was compressed. No long setup. No ideal offset. This would not be a textbook intercept. He fired anyway. The burst was longer than planned. 3 seconds instead of 2. Enough rounds to ensure destruction, but too many for comfort. The bomber broke apart and fell burning toward the ground, but Smith did not watch it die. He was already turning away. Because now the fight was over. The radar scope showed nothing else approaching the airfield. The remaining bombers had turned back or scattered beyond reach. The ground below remained dark and intact. Smith pointed the aircraft toward home. The fuel gauge was no longer a variable. It was a countdown. Porter began navigating by terrain returns, guiding Smith toward the airfield using radar instead of sight. The island appeared as a rough outline on the scope. Coastline first. Then inland contours. Somewhere within that shape lay the runway. Smith scanned ahead. There were no lights. At first, he assumed distance. Then alignment. Then angle. But as the minutes passed and the expected glow failed to appear, understanding settled in with cold clarity. The runway lights were out. This was not an enemy action. Not sabotage. Not attack. It was something simpler and more dangerous. A technical failure. A human error. A system built in haste failing at the exact moment precision was required. Smith did not speak. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter. The device measured height above ground by bouncing signals downward. It was accurate enough to prevent flying into terrain, but it was never intended for blind landing. It could not show obstacles. It could not show alignment. It could only tell you how close you were to hitting something. Smith acknowledged. Fuel dropped again. Diverting was impossible. The nearest alternate airfield was far beyond reach. Ditching at sea at night meant death by impact or drowning. Waiting for the lights to return would burn fuel that no longer existed. There was one option left. Smith flew toward where the runway should be. He slowed the aircraft carefully, mindful of stall speed. Too slow and the aircraft would fall. Too fast and the landing gear would fail. Without visual reference, speed judgment came entirely from instruments and memory. The radar altimeter numbers unwound steadily. 500 feet. 400. 3. Smith descended by calculation alone. Heading held steady. No correction unless absolutely necessary. Any deviation might put the aircraft into trees, construction equipment, or uneven coral. The cockpit was silent except for engine noise and Porter's measured calls. Altitude. Descent rate. Distance estimates that grew less precise the closer they came to the ground. Fuel reached a level Smith no longer calculated in percentages. He calculated in seconds. The ground did not appear. At 200 feet, Smith committed fully. There was no going around. No second attempt. He reduced power and held attitude, trusting the numbers and nothing else. 100 feet. 50. The aircraft touched down hard. The impact was solid, unmistakable. Landing gear absorbed the force. The aircraft bounced once, then settled. Smith applied brakes cautiously, afraid that any aggressive input might send them off the runway into darkness. The Black Widow rolled to a stop. Engines idled unevenly. Fuel was almost gone. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then ground crew lights appeared, white beams cutting through darkness as men ran toward the aircraft. Smith shut down the engines. The sudden silence felt unnatural after an hour of tension. Porter climbed out slowly. Smith followed. The airfield was intact. No craters. No fires. No bodies. The mission had succeeded. But Smith did not feel victorious. He had not beaten the enemy. He had outlasted the math. Barely. What remained was not relief, but a sober understanding of how close the margin had been to zero. How easily success could have turned into disappearance. Control had not failed because of enemy action. It had failed because systems always fail somewhere. And when they did, only judgment remained. By dawn, Morro was still standing. The runways showed no fresh craters. Fuel dumps were intact. Ammunition stacks remained covered and untouched. Construction crews went back to work as if the night raids had never happened. Within days, the airfields would support fighters covering the Lingayen Gulf landings. Within weeks, American aircraft would dominate the skies over northern Luzon. None of that carried Smith's name. The official reports were brief. Times. Altitudes. Aircraft types destroyed. 4 bombers. 1 fighter. Engagement duration. Fuel state on landing. Everything reduced to lines of text that fit neatly into after-action summaries. The paperwork captured outcomes, not tension. It recorded success without describing how close it came to failure. From a strategic perspective, the night changed little on paper. The invasion went forward as planned. Japanese night raids continued elsewhere, less confidently, more cautiously. Radar-directed interception became the new reality. Darkness stopped being protection and became another variable to manage. That was the real shift. Not one pilot's score. A system had broken. The Japanese belief that night guaranteed safety did not survive contact with radar. Once that belief collapsed, bomber crews adapted, altered routes, reduced exposure, or abandoned missions altogether. The cost of flying blind rose sharply. The night sky no longer belonged to anyone by default. For the Americans, the lesson was quieter but just as important. Technology could extend capability, but it could not eliminate dependence. Radar allowed interception. Guns allowed destruction. Engines allowed pursuit. But landing still required light. Fuel still obeyed physics. Every system carried a failure point, and those points aligned without warning. Smith understood that better than most. He did not celebrate. He did not seek recognition. He returned the aircraft, wrote his report, and flew again when ordered. His record would eventually mark him as the top American night fighter ace of the war, but that distinction lived in archives, not headlines. The P-61 he flew did not survive. Like most Black Widows, it was scrapped after the war. Metal reclaimed. Systems dismantled. Its radar, once revolutionary, became obsolete within a decade. Only a handful of the type remain today, none carrying the marks of that night. The men did not vanish. Philip Porter received recognition for his role, as radar operators finally began to be understood as more than passengers. Night fighting was acknowledged for what it was, a team effort where judgment mattered as much as machinery. Smith returned home, left military service, and lived quietly. He never wrote memoirs. He never built his identity around what happened over Morro. For him, it had been a job done under constraint, not a story to be told. That restraint is why the night matters. Not because of how many aircraft fell, but because it showed how modern war actually turned. Not on speeches or symbols, but on decisions made with incomplete information, shrinking margins, and no certainty of survival. 1 aircraft. 1 crew. 1 hour. The difference between success and disappearance measured not in courage, but in math.